The cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul are not populous or economically grandiose enough to loom large in the American landscape, culturally or literally. St. Paul's population at 303,000 and Minneapolis's at 425,000 are lower combined than that of Seattle, Washington, and Seattle itself is only the 18th largest city in America. The median income is approximately $75,000, which is less than half that of San Ramon, California, the 25th richest city in America. Usually, when the Twin Cities are mentioned in popular culture, they're treated as kitsch. That's the region where people with Nordic accents say things like "you betcha." It's where there's a disproportionately large amount of interest in the baseball team, the Twins, and the football team, the Vikings, and even those are often overshadowed by teams like the Cubs from Chicago and the Packers from Green Bay, Wisconsin. As we'll see, this is the kind of low profile that many of the most prominent citizens of the Twin Cities like. Despite having such an enduring veneer of heartland wholesomeness that there's the popular phrase Minnesota nice, looking through its history and current events, Minneapolis and St. Paul are much closer to deserving Chicago's reputation for rampant corruption and criminality than they're generally perceived. Not that their criminal element mind being overshadowed, as they tend to not want to draw attention to themselves. Yet the story of how the Twin Cities have been hotbeds of crime is as flamboyant and harrowing as it is sometimes bewildering. Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today's script has been provided by Dustin Koski. If you dig the words Dustin is putting into my mouth, give him a shout out in the comments as you deploy your likes, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who loves learning the fascinating history behind our most famous cities. And if you don't, complain to him in the comments. Let's get to it. The two most prominent Native American communities to settle in the current Minneapolis-St. Paul were the Dakota and the Ojibwe tribes. The Dakota arrived centuries earlier and spread far further, first appearing in the archaeological record by Bedote, the Dakota word for the junction of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers, and Spirit Lake. Minneapolis is derived from the Dakota word for land of many lakes. The Ojibwe were a relatively recent arrival, having traveled from the Atlantic coast in the 16th century. Despite the fact that Dakota society held kinship between all peoples in high esteem, its relationship with the Ojibwe tribe was largely defined by war. These were not small tribal squabbles either. Battles such as the Brule River Battle of 1642 left 300 Dakotas dead. The 1770 Battle of the Dalles by the St. Croix River to the east of modern Twin Cities was likely the largest one, and also distinct among battles the Dakota and Ojibwe had, in that it was the Fox tribe that got caught in the middle of the melee and suffered the largest number of deaths. Later, the Dakota would get some revenge for Brule River in 1805 by killing 500 Ojibwe at the Battle of Mole Lake. Even as late as 1858, when European colonizers had already forced many of them into and out of reservations, there were battles like the Battle of Shakopee, where hundreds of Dakota and Ojibwe fired at each other from across a river. Such communities were certainly willing to turn this wrath on Europeans and Americans in some particularly vicious clashes. On June 5th, 1736, the Dakota received false reports from a Cree tribe, the actual culprits, that it was some Frenchmen who had shot at the Dakota. When the Dakota found 21 Frenchmen the next day, they killed 19 with weapons and 2 by drowning, then beheaded them all. More than a century later, the Dakotas were tricked again in 1862 when they ceded land to the US government in exchange for food supplies that never manifested. The resulting war lasted 6 weeks, cost roughly 600 settlers their lives, and ended with thousands of Dakotas taken prisoner. President Lincoln ultimately allowed 38 of them to be executed in modern-day Mankato on December 23rd of that year in the largest mass execution in American history, though he had pardoned nearly 2,000 in the process. This event is generally regarded as the end of the Dakota-Ojibwe War. The single event that is generally denoted as the starting point for the settling of the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area was the 1825 founding of Fort Snelling. The fort was nominally created to serve as a mediating presence between the Dakota and Ojibwe. Fort Snelling never directly took part in a major battle, and its presence did little to bring peace between the warring tribes. Yet it would be closely associated with two of the most ignominious aspects of American history. For one thing, it was the home for most of the 1830s of Harriet and Dred Scott, the couple whose names would later be immortalized in the landmark 1857 Scott v. Sanford Supreme Court decision. It was while working at Fort Snelling that Scott was able to acquire the funds and connections to launch the famous suit that would end with him and all of Black Americans being ruled as having no rights under the Constitution. This was surely a surprise to the Scotts and Council, as in 1836 a Missouri judge had already ruled that slaves living on free soil could claim to have been naturalized into freedom. This court ruling angered and radicalized many in Minnesota against slavery. Thus, Snelling could claim to be one of the hotbeds of the Western abolitionist movement in the United States. Slightly later, Fort Snelling had the distinction of serving as an overcrowded American concentration camp. In response to the Dakota-American War in the autumn and winter of 1862, 1,700 Dakotas were forced into 4 main camps on Fort Snelling. Even by the notoriously inhospitable nature of concentration camps, Snellings were cold, miserable, and dangerous. The fort claimed that their intention was actually to protect the Dakotas from vigilante reprisals, as it was known even at the time that the remaining Dakotas had nothing to do with the attacks on settlers, as the vengeful Dakotas had already fled. That was part of why Lincoln pardoned all but 38 of the Dakotas charged with the crime. Still, considering that the guards often found themselves needing to defend the Dakotas from other guards, it was at heart a very flawed endeavor. This need for a veneer of plausible deniability while crimes continued beneath the surface proved very enduring. When Colonel Josiah Snelling had mills installed in the fort that would bear his name, he was unwittingly putting the fledgling community on a course that would make it famous. By 1848, Minneapolis had become America's largest producer of lumber, such that by 1875, 20 railcars of lumber were shipped out a day from a single company. By 1890, there were 20,000 full-time lumberjacks working in the city. By 1900, a staggering 2 of the 4 largest lumber mills in America were located in Minneapolis, and a third was located in Minnesota, the majority of the wood they produced being white pine. There were major innovations to the industrial process, both technological and for workers. For example, there were safety features installed on equipment unmatched anywhere else in the nation, and worker protections such as employee compensation for those injured in the line of duty. This was a major contributor to Minnesota's status as a labor-friendly state today. Even so, under such heady economic conditions, moderation and conservation were the last things on anyone's mind. By 1910, Minneapolis used up its lumber supplies to such an extent that it fell from that lofty status as log leader. Fortunately for the captains of Minneapolis's industry, even as they were clear-cutting away their most prominent industry, a second one was rising to replace it. Now, flour might not sound like the most exciting industry, but it turned out that St. Anthony Falls was powerful enough to power 20 flour mills, and turn Minneapolis into the literal flour capital of the world, while it was also the lumber capital. At its height in 1880, enough flour for 12 million loaves of bread were ground in its mills a day. When the Washburn A mill literally exploded in 1878 and was out of commission for 2 years, the most lasting effect this had was allowing the mill owners to swap in more modern and advanced technology. Between 1870 and 1890, the economic boom caused the population to jump from 13,000 to 185,000 from the sheer amount of labor and opportunity. Household name companies such as Pillsbury were founded and flourished in this environment, for the flour boom lasted decades after the lumber boom concluded. It was ultimately the expansion of New York industry and tariffs put in place as a response to the Great Depression that ended Minneapolis's globe-bestriding flour power status by 1930. For anyone who has ever wondered why Minneapolis and St. Paul didn't merge into one city, it was largely prevented during this time. Despite production rates heavily favoring Minneapolis, St. Paul mill owners and other business leaders still felt fierce competition with them, and would not allow their municipal leaders to move ahead with a city merger. Demographically, the two communities were very different as well. Minneapolis was Protestant Republicans, and St. Paul was overwhelmingly Catholic Democrats, so the move was opposed on the popular front as well. Wherever large amounts of wealth flows, it's sure to bring lots of scum with it. By far, the most famous example of this to emerge from the Twin Cities' twin manufacturing booms was Albert Ames, better known as Doc Ames, the mayor of Minneapolis from 1876 to 1903. It was no wonder why he was elected for his first term. He was a veteran of the Civil War in the Minnesota 9th Volunteers, a generally respected businessman and physician, a 1867 Minnesota state representative, and experienced enough with media to become editor of the Alto, California newspaper during a stay in California. He even had the touching personal story of only moving back to Minnesota from California in 1874 to aid his father as he passed away. There was an early indicator of his opportunism in that he switched from being a Republican to a Democrat once he was unable to get the 1876 Republican nomination, but his first few terms were scandal-free. It wasn't until his fourth in 1900 that troubles started coming to light. For one thing, Ames began to openly visit saloons, gambling houses, and brothels. What surely sounded as much like a comically weak excuse then as it does now, he claimed that he was doing so because he was performing inspections to make sure that the businesses of ill repute were following the loose regulations of the period. Why he would need to do this personally was not explained. Adding to the suspiciousness of his behavior was swapping out the chief of police with his brother Fred and much of the rest of the police force while he was at it. It would be during this period that Ames supposedly said, "I like to have bad men with me. I can make them do anything." It was actually what might sound like a petty gambling scheme that brought down Ames. Two card sharks running rigged games where, if the victim called them on it, a crooked police officer would intervene, were arrested in 1902. Infuriated that they got arrested despite their corrupt connections, they entered their ledgers implicating the police, courts, and even Ames into evidence for revenge. Ames addressed public outcry over the accusations by making an unannounced trip to West Baden, Indiana, resigning as mayor, and then making another unannounced trip to Louisville, Kentucky. Authorities tracked him down and arrested him in February 1903. While he was convicted, the conviction was overturned on appeal. Less fortunate were his brother and other collaborators on the police force, putting Ames's allegedly not guilty status further in doubt. The damage to Minneapolis's reputation lingered, exacerbated by a January 1903 article in the nationally syndicated publication McClure's Magazine, which featured a summary of the scandal entitled "The Shame of Minneapolis." In the same year that Ames began the term that would disgrace him and his entire city, the St. Paul Police Department came up with a far more brazenly corrupt plan, if you can believe it. Soon after his appointment to Chief of Police on June 11, 1900, John O'Connor sent the word out that criminals wanted elsewhere in America could take shelter in St. Paul. There were three conditions, of course. Criminals seeking asylum had to stop at the Hotel Savoy and register their residency in St. Paul. Second, they had to pay a bribe. Third, they couldn't commit crimes, at least not major ones, while within St. Paul jurisdiction. This informal agreement became known as the O'Connor Layover Agreement. This may sound like a cartoonishly bad idea, sure to have brought about O'Connor's swift downfall, but in practice crime plummeted in St. Paul. Indeed, criminal organizations policed each other out of concern that some other criminals would derail the gravy train. Furthermore, all the bribes were functionally good economic stimulus for St. Paul at a time when the lumber industry was beginning a downward trend. For the rest of the state of Minnesota, bringing in a bunch of career criminals and giving them a safe haven was inevitably a disaster. So much bank robbery took place that despite Minnesota being a lightly populated state, a full 20% of American bank robberies in 1932 occurred within its borders outside St. Paul. Yes, in 1932. Meaning that the layover agreement was still effectively in place decades later, well past O'Connor's retirement from the police in 1920. It would be the repeal of Prohibition that would bring about an end to the layover agreement. Prohibition created a boom in the crime industry for the one city in the Midwest where bootleggers could openly run from the police after brewing and selling out of town. When the repeal of the 18th Amendment took place in 1933, a bloated criminal enterprise had to replace its main industry quickly, and in its haste, began committing all sorts of major crimes in St. Paul itself. It would take a concerted effort by grassroots organizers and the intervention of the newly empowered Federal Bureau of Investigation to bring an end to the layover agreement, not to mention the arrest and replacement of much of the openly corrupt police force who'd based their careers around it. The last remnants of the layover agreement were cleared out by 1935. By the mid-20th century, it would be fair to say crime in the Twin Cities had at least stopped being so bizarre and extreme. However, in the 1950s through the 1960s, the Twin Cities had a wave that was not much better. Fires. In at least one category, this was not mysterious at all. In 1956, the St. Paul Health Department declared a number of homes a health hazard. The homes just happened to be concentrated in a majority immigrant neighborhood. Nothing suspicious about that, right? Including immigrants from Mexico, Ireland, Italy, and Sweden. The Swedes were particularly prominent in the area, and it was commonly nicknamed Swede Hollow. That came to a definitive end on December 11th, 1956, when police arrived, doused the homes with gasoline, and burnt the community to the ground after the residents had been relocated. Additionally, as reported by the Minnesota Star-Tribune, throughout the 50s and 60s, there were many large fires among buildings from the Victorian era in St. Paul, which took the lives of 17 people with them. The incidents drew extra scrutiny, because it seemed suspiciously like the fires were conveniently striking buildings that were in the way of real estate developments and modernizing downtown St. Paul. As we'll soon see, it would not be the last time fires in the Twin Cities raised suspicions. By the time the 70s and 80s rolled around, Minneapolis-St. Paul were hit like the rest of the American Midwest by recession and industrial decline. Between 1970 and 1990, the number of residents living in high-poverty neighborhoods went from 21% to 33%. The fate of the Whirlpool plant, a manufacturer of refrigerators on Arcade Street in East St. Paul, was typical of the period, going from 4,000 employees in 1955 to, by 1984, only having 625. By January of 1985, it had dropped to 0. Against a background of such economic misery, it was unsurprising that crime in the Twin Cities increased. One more of the famous ways it spiked was a dramatic increase in the murder rate. You always want to hear that, right? That's good news. For several years of the early 1990s, it hovered around 60 murders per year. Then in 1995, jumped up to 97, which, as the New York Times reported, made the city deadlier per capita than New York City. T-shirts reading Murderopolis became popular within the city, especially after drive-bys killed a 22-year-old and an 11-year-old within the span of a week. Then Deputy Police Chief Greg Hessness would later describe the official municipal response to the swelling murder rate as essentially expanding the police force and making surgical arrests within gangs. The murder rate dramatically fell, and though there were fluctuations, remained low for a long time, so that in 2019 there were a relatively few 36 murders in Minneapolis. How much of this is attributable to aggressive law enforcement or to the fact that the number of residents living in high-poverty neighborhoods declined from 33% to 15% is undetermined, but surely both were contributing factors. Tensions were already high on Monday, May 25th, 2020. Minneapolis and St. Paul were under a particularly strict version of the coronavirus pandemic lockdown, and it was the year of a contentious national election. Yet, surely, the store clerk who put a call in to the Minneapolis police reporting that a man had bought cigarettes with a counterfeit $20 bill had no idea what they could be setting in motion. In body camera footage released later of the arrest, counterfeiting suspect George Floyd was taken from his car at gunpoint by police during his arrest, and then refused to get in the back of a squad car, lying on the ground to resist. Officer Derek Chauvin then put his knee on the back of Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes, as did the two accompanying officers. Floyd died shortly after arriving at the hospital, a death that would be ruled in June 2020 to have been caused by cardiopulmonary arrest. Riots began in the Twin Cities the next day. If you're being arrested for counterfeiting, I really don't think that suffocation is an appropriate response from police. Maybe that's just me. Initial official response to the outrage was fairly limited. Although Mayor Jacob Frey announced promptly that the officers were terminated, the Hennepin County Attorney General initially expressed a refusal to prosecute. Then on Wednesday, May 27th, Minneapolis' 3rd Precinct was burned to the ground by protesters. Friday that week, the officers were arrested. By the time the protests ended, 5 miles of Minneapolis businesses had been damaged or destroyed. The protests were by no means contained to the Twin Cities, with nationwide riots requiring the National Guard being called in 21 states taking place. By October 2020, 9 Black Lives Matter protesters had been killed. Despite an accompanying rallying cry to defund the police during the protests, one of the results would be that President Joe Biden would spend the next few years calling for increases of billions of dollars for police budgets across the United States. During Derek Chauvin's 11-month trial that would ultimately result in his conviction and 21-year prison sentence, it also came out that in 2006 Derek Chauvin had been one of several officers to shoot Wayne Reyes, a controversial officer-involved shooting, even though Reyes had a shotgun he supposedly aimed at officers. And the script doesn't say this, but the reason why it's controversial is because Reyes was shot 21 times by 6 officers. When news of this surfaced in 2020, it also came out that Senator, recent presidential, then vice presidential nominee hopeful Amy Klobuchar had been a Hennepin County prosecutor when Reyes was shot, and word spread that she had failed to prosecute the officer at a time when it could have prevented a later murder. Despite Klobuchar's defense that she had left the case to her successor and a grand jury, CNN reported that it almost certainly sunk her chances to be President Biden's running mate for 2020. Given Biden's decision to not seek re-election in 2024, it's very likely that if Klobuchar had been selected, she'd have entered the history books in the prominent position of the Democratic nominee for president. Such are the potential consequences of a Minneapolis store clerk reporting a counterfeit bill, it would seem. And the clerk, by the way, felt absolutely awful after reporting that, because he basically watched George Floyd die as a result of his decision. In the end, despite all the turmoil that has taken place in and around them, the Twin Cities have generally returned to the background. The thing about that state of affairs is that in the out-of-the-way, quieter places, all sorts of trouble for everyone else can be brewing. Whether it's a giant economic comeback, a new problematic law enforcement system, or a new crime wave, who knows what could bring the eyes of the world back to Minneapolis, St. Paul. I hope you learned something today, and if you dug today's video, be sure to subscribe, deploy your likes, comment whether you think Dustin was right in comparing the crime rates of the Twin Cities to Chicago, and share this video with someone who loves learning about the fascinating history behind some of our most famous cities. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.